All right, I am going to get started because I believe we are 1 minute past due and I do not like wasting people's times. I am going to share my screen with y'all, start my presentation. Thank you all for coming. My name is Kareem Neal. I am a self-contained special education teacher at Maryville High School in the Phoenix Union High School District. Strong shout out for the Phoenix Union folks in here. I know at least one is here because I see Dr. Coleman. I've been a special education teacher for 25 years. This is my 25th year. 15 years at Maryville High, and then I started teaching in New Jersey. Always taught self-contained special education, so it has been my passion. And the presentation I'm giving you today on inclusion came through a lot of my social justice work. I run a social justice program at my school. It's a uni town. If anybody does any of those kinds of programs, they know. And through that, I like to talk a lot about who is centered in conversation and who is not centered in conversations. And my folks are almost never centered in any schools. I did teach at a school for kids with autism. So of course they were there. It was a very small school. All of the students had autism. But since I've been a regular at school, while my school is a very warm and welcoming school, like most standard high schools, the students there who are centered are, of course, the gen ed students. And that's kind of how I came up with this presentation and came up with this thought process. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to dole it out to folks around the country a few times. And now I'm giving it to y'all. So we're going to get started. I do see everybody's welcoming each other. Cool. All right. So I love to start with a quote through all of my sessions, mostly because I'm also a restorative justice trainer, and in restorative justice, you often open up circles. Hopefully y'all have a chance to do some community building circles in your classrooms and your educational spaces. And this quote, I think, is amazing in that it covers so many things. Like when I talk about racial justice, when I talk about implicit bias, I often use this quote. If you've ever done a session with me, there's a good chance you've seen it. If I've done an implicit bias session with you, if I've done a session on restorative justice with you, you probably see it. And the quote is, across the country, definition of inclusion is offered. It's generally accepted that inclusion means inviting those who've been historically locked out to come in. This well-intentioned meaning must be strengthened. A weakness in the definition is evident. Who has the authority or right to invite others in? And how did the inviters get in? Finally, who is doing the excluding? Now, I won't read the full quote for you because I don't just like reading PowerPoints, but that part is kind of the key to all of this work. And that is, we think of inclusion right now. I know if you are at a school and y'all school has inclusion in any way, shape, or form, it's probably similar to this. This is gen ed teachers, gen ed classrooms, administrators at the school, figuring out ways to let students in special education programs come into a general ed classroom for a period, maybe 2 periods, maybe even like a co-taught classroom every once in a while. But that's typically the way it's done. And I am here to assume, I'm going to assume that none of your schools have gen ed students coming to special education classrooms other than for those gen ed students to help the students in the classroom. So every once in a while, you will have a TA come to your classroom. I used to have that in my classrooms. Like we would have a couple TAs, and they would come in and they would, help my students, right? My students maybe who were in a wheelchair, and they would maybe push them to the lunchroom and help us feed or something like that. And even some of them would help with schoolwork. But I had never seen, up until I started doing it, because I just started doing it, I've never seen a program in which students would just come and learn with the students with special needs and pick up some of the things that the students with special needs do well. And I'm here to say to y'all that students, even in self-contained classrooms, which is probably going to be the most restrictive type of learning environment in any school, even students in self-contained classrooms have a lot to offer their gen ed peers and even their gifted peers and whatever else types of students you have, IB, if you're in that kind of school. They have a lot to offer those folks. And part of what clicked in for me is when I was in college. I was a chemical engineering major undergrad at Seton Hall University in New Jersey. Strong shout out to Seton Hall. I was working at the gym at my school, and I was like the person who would set up the items for the events, and that event was the Special Olympics. And so one of the instructors of the students came over to me and said, "Would you mind coming over to talk to the students, because they're enthralled by how tall you are." So if anybody knows me in real life, I'm 6'7", so I think most people are often enthralled by how tall I am. But they were really enthralled, and they said, "Would you come over and talk to them?" And so I went over and I talked to them, and they were like the most authentic group of folks I had met at the time, right? I had never really met any people with a significant cognitive disability or anything like that. So when I talked to them, it like clicked in me, and I decided, I think I know what I want to do with my life. So I went straight to graduate school to be a special education teacher. Now, this was all, 29 years ago or so, 28 years ago, maybe. And so I remember thinking that from that conversation, I like when people talk to me about my journey through special education, I talk about that conversation. I was like, "Oh yeah, I was at Special Olympics I got," and I tell that story if people ever ask me how I got into teaching or something like that. But what I started to think about a lot was along with the fact that, I feel like that day changed my life, which is huge, right? But I felt like after that meeting that day with the Special Olympics folks, I started to also be a more authentic version of myself, because I was like, yes, I want to be like this. Like, there was a kid who was wearing a cape, right? There was a kid who hugged me at the end. It was a boy. He was like, "I really like you." And I was like, boys who hung with me at the time would never do anything like that. And I felt like I wound up taking away a lot that day, right? More so than just my career. So when I started thinking about like this concept, it was, but if we keep doing inclusion like we do inclusion, in which there's kind of this hierarchical feel, right? There's this gen ed tier, special ed underneath. We won't get a chance for many people to experience what I experienced that day, because they're not meeting their peers on that level, because they are peers. They're not meeting them on that level, and maybe we're robbing them of the opportunity of learning something huge from the folks in special education programs. All right, so the session outcomes, I want us to identify potential partners in I call it new inclusion journey, so new way of doing inclusion. And the reason why that's important is because when you start to do something a little bit different, as probably all of you know, I'm assuming your educators are giving your time on the weekends. You are probably like the go above and beyond types of educators, right? When you're trying to do something huge, big, different on your campuses, wherever you teach, whatever your experience, I know some people probably do home care and things like that. You will need partners, or else you will find yourself getting roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. So identifying partners is huge for you. A list of questions that students in Gen Ed classes could use in order to challenge their own perspectives. So one of my slides will have a list of questions for Gen Ed teachers for when they bring their Gen Ed students over, because in this journey, I'm going to be asking of Gen Ed teachers or special ed teachers to invite Gen Ed teachers into their classrooms for a different type of inclusion experience, right? And when you do that, though, you do need a guideline, because I don't want to just say, "Oh, throw them in there and say, all right, everybody, go learn. Good luck out there," right? So I do have a guideline for that, which I think will be really helpful. And then I'm hoping that, the biggest outcome is a renewed perspective in how school inclusion should look. And I think it's not just a perspective about inclusion, but just like schools, because schools, like the world, center folks, right? Schools still center a certain type of learner, right? They still center, boys. They still center white folks. They still center middle or upper class folks, right? And so they still center folks without disabilities. All of that stuff is still happening in schools as well. So when thinking of the model inclusion, we can think about how we can change schools overall. All right. And so I kind of explained my teaching journey. So I won't tell that story again, right? My teaching journey happened in the Special Olympics. That day was step one. And then I went to graduate school and I was a student. I was like a paraprofessional at a school for students with autism, and then eventually became a teacher there in New Jersey, Developmental Learning Center of New Providence. If anybody's a New Jersey person and knows that was my first school. Was there for 3 years. So my journey to building community, like I said, a lot of that was through my restorative justice work. So I started doing restorative justice work about 4 to 5 years ago. Although I was doing a lot of community building like you all are, so that didn't have to be, it didn't have to be sanctioned or, oh, this is the moment I did it. Because I was doing a lot of community building because I did circles in my classroom prior to that, just because I was trained that way at the Developmental Learning Center. Strong shout out to Kristen Rodriguez. But when I started doing restorative justice work is when I realized the link between building community in your classroom and eliminating bias. And that was a big link, right? It was, we are getting to know each other on a deeper level. Everybody is being seen and heard in a classroom. And thus, you truly are not leaving people out, right? We often hear initiatives from, organizations, schools that we work in, heck, our government, about how we're going to bring some people together. We're going to help the Black folks. We're going to help the immigrants. We're going to help whatever it is, right? And they're not really doing anything but saying, we're going to put an initiative together, as opposed to putting the people together. Because putting people together is going to actually be the most effective way in eliminating bias, right? And so in building that community, I was doing this really good job of building community in my classroom, like probably a lot of y'all is. And yes, language is centered. I saw somebody write that in the chat room. Thank you. As I was building my classroom community, I realized we were doing a really strong job, but we were also leaving people out. No, we were leaving out parents and family. So when I started including those folks into our community building, now, of course, they were not sitting in circles in my classroom. Well, every once in a while, a parent would come, but not very often, right? But I was talking to them more. I was figuring out language. It's great that somebody brought up language, because I found out a way to communicate with my parents better, who were Spanish speakers, because I had a decent amount of Spanish speakers. My school is about, I think it's 89% Latinx folks. And so a lot of them, of course, feel more comfortable at home speaking Spanish. And so I found a tool to do that through Class Dojo, which is an online tool. And they got more comfortable with me, because before they would lean on, I had a paraprofessional in my classroom who spoke Spanish at the time, right? They would lean on her a lot and talk through her to get to me. And so as I strengthened that community, it was like, man, we got a really good thing going. But then I've been working on my school for a long time, right? And my social justice club is getting bigger and bigger. And I've had hundreds of students who go to my camps and things like that, which is great. But it was like, what's happening though? A lot of these folks aren't connecting with my students no matter what, even the ones who work with them sometimes. Even the ones who come to the classroom sometimes, they still viewed them as someone to teach, someone to kind of, look up to them, but they weren't thinking of them like their peers at all. That was not happening. And I was like, there's a bias in the way that this program is happening. There's a bias in the way that inclusive programs happen. It's great. And I am for it, by the way. I'm a person who is saying inclusion programs, good, for it, right? But there's still a bias that's going to happen from them. And that bias is the people who are being, who are kind of, are being centered, the Gen Ed folks, are viewing this as, these are kind of kids to be taught, right? They're not my peers. I cannot learn something from them. And if you feel that way, you are not looking at them in a way where you can then pull out all of the gifts from them. You were just saying, I wonder what I can do to help them next. And if you talk to gen ed kids who work with special ed kids, talk to them and say, hey, are you really friends with any of them? Ask them that. Because if they don't have real friendships with them, what have y'all been doing all this time? Because you can have a gen ed folk class, a person in your class for a year who's amazing, who loves your kids. And then after they leave, they never talk to your student even one time ever. And I learned a lot of this from the parents in my class. I said to them, I'm thinking of a student in particular, his name is Sean. I said, Sean talked a lot about this kid, Jose, in our People PE class. I'm going to talk about People PE a little bit later. Talks a lot about him. Does he ever talk to Sean? Because Sean was a kid in my classroom who was very social. He played like the online games in which you communicate. He's able to talk, text, and do those kinds of things, which sometimes for special ed classrooms, self-contained classrooms is rare. And I was like, do they ever talk, play video games? Does he ever come over? And she was like, I don't even know that person. Right. And so when I started talking to parents, I started saying, hey, if your kid is talking about how great this person is, wonder why they're not around. Invite them to your home. Change that dynamic of them feeling like that they have some kind of power over them, right? That they are in this role of like instructor to your kids, or they are there to help them or pity them. Change that dynamic, because they're not friends if that's the case, right? It's like, do you call your students your friends? You don't. And they are viewing them that same way. But they're peers, and they shouldn't be viewing them that way. So part of my community building and my breaking of bias was, hey, I'm participating in a program that lends to bias as well. What can I do to change it? All right. And how to build stronger school communities through equity and inclusion. So what happens with, and I wrote, scrapping book loan, social media posts, TV, and all that stuff. I wrote that just to say that your schools need to connect better somehow, right? It can't just be every once in a while at a pep rally, during a Special Olympics event. We have to figure out a way in which all peers feel the same. And here goes a thought that for all the folks here who teach in a regular ed set, like a typical school. Do the folks in your gifted programs feel like the folks in gen ed programs are not on their level, right? Not academically, but would they be like, oh, I don't hang with them, I just like help them? That's not how it works. Am I wrong? I see people shaking their heads. That's not how that. We don't center the gifted kids because of their academic acumen. But somehow we're saying to the gen ed kids, well, your academic acumen is higher than the folks in special ed programs, so you should be helping them. Ridiculous. But we never thought about it like that. And that is part of why I do this thing. If we thought about it like that, imagine how every gen ed kid on your campus feels like, oh, because the gifted kids do have better test scores, I can't hang out with them. But that is how it's happening with special ed programs. We're not saying it, but we're doing it. And then the last thing was, exactly. I see somebody said they're not accounting for emotion, EQ at all. And that is the truth. It is, we talk about it. Educators talk about it. Principals talk about it. Superintendents even talk about social emotional learning and this, that, and the other. But you're clearly not valuing it, because a lot of my students have it right. And that is what a lot of those students can learn. A lot of my students will sit next to their students who are not feeling well and say, I love you. What can I do to help you? A lot of my students will raise their hands 12 times in a row after missing a problem on the board. I will say, hey, anybody know the three branches of government, right? I teach history as well. And so, some student will raise their hand and totally blow it. And when you think about when that happens in a gen ed room, probably a gifted room too. I've not seen gifted rooms work too often. You see somebody raise their hand, miss a question. How often do you see them immediately shoot their hand back up? No. They shut it down. They're like, no, I'm not putting myself out there again. And all of that is a part of kind of emotional intelligence, a part of building better people, building more self-actualized people. We should not feel ashamed because we didn't know something. Heck, we're in school, we're trying to learn new things, right? But that's how a lot of folks feel. And folks in my class don't feel that way. We all know, because we have this great community, we love support each other, and we do it openly, that you can do that 12 times in a row. My students, I talked about Sean. He's one of the students in my classroom. He can move around campus on his own, which is pretty rare. Most of my students, they're walking with me for safety reasons and things like that. Move around campus on his own, like I said, socially pretty high, and even academically for my class, a bit higher than most of the students academically are, right? But Sean's not in my classroom thinking thinking they need to lean on him to learn stuff. He's in my classroom just like them, being their friends, not judging them based on their academic acumen. Heck, not judging them based on their emotional intelligence or any of that kind of stuff. Just being with them and being friends. And why then, if we're saying, hey, in a special ed classroom, there's all kinds of levels of learning. We know this. If you've ever been in a special ed classroom, there's all types of levels of learning. We're never saying, well, these folks, because they're reading on the kindergarten level and this dude is reading on the first grade level, they can't really hang. But we're doing it with gen ed, special ed, and you know what I mean? We're separating those populations and making them feel like they can't. All right, let's move on. Growth mindset, someone said, very nice, very nice. All right, typical schools, models of inclusion. I wanted, and I put these up there, I kind of talked about how, so in our school, we have mostly the model in which folks in special ed classrooms will sit in a gen ed classroom or two based on their learning levels, right? Throughout the day. And, and every once in a while, we do have, a student who does like a typical PE class as well, or a typical elective class, which I think counts as inclusion as well. But we definitely do not have a program in which gen ed students sit in special ed classroom. It started happening because I started doing it. And I'm going to talk about that because I think that's important. And not like, I am a maverick who goes against the rules. I'm not really. But what happens a lot, you'll see, is if you teach self-contained in a typical school, so often gen ed teachers who are great, like those gen ed teachers who love doing all the things, and they have like this, whether they call it a soft spot for the kids in special ed classes or whatever, they will invite my class in. They'll be like, oh, come on in. During advisory, we have like advisory periods in our district. Come on in. We're going to do some games, or we're going to build some things together, kind of fun team building type activities, right? So I would do that. I would love that. My students would love it, the whole 9 yards. But I started saying, when someone asked me, I started saying, also, can I have a time when you come to me? Every time now. Any teacher in my class, or if any of them are here, I didn't see their names yet, but I don't see all the names. They will know that if they ask me and to bring my students to their class, I simply just ask them to bring their class to mine. And that was like my first step. So like I said, this is not maverick, this is not renegade, this is not going against any rules. They were like, oh, come to one of our advisors. So simple. And then I gave them this list of questions I'm going to give y'all pretty soon. You're going to have to take a picture of it, but I don't know if Nstoy will send the whole presentation out. But feel free to also email me. I'm kareemneal7@gmail.com. I'll put it in the chat. Feel free to email me if you straight up want that. I was not able to put it in my resources area because obviously, as you saw in the beginning of this, I'm not necessarily the strongest with technology. Not scared of it, like most folks my age, but I'm not necessarily strongest. So I did put my email in there if you want it faster or something like that, or if you couldn't take a picture of it when it comes up. And as I told y'all before, this model leads to a feeling of school hierarchy, right? And that's why, as I talked about earlier, this being a part of my journey through social justice and teaching, is the hierarchy affects the way they feel about their special ed peers, but that affects all systems, right? So if you have a student who, when they're, let's say 9th grade, it happens. I don't know if it happens in middle schools. I haven't taught middle schools. If you're a middle school teacher, you see that right there. Go ahead and, in the chat, maybe say in middle school, the inclusion model is very similar. and elementary school as well. I don't think it is in elementary school, but whenever that program happens for them, whenever they see the kind of hierarchical feel of that program, they then realize that centering is okay. When you think about it, right? Obviously, most of the things that happen in life, right, from a kid, it's not happening because someone's saying, hey, you need to be sexist, you need to be racist, you need to be ableist, all of those things. That's not how that happens, right? And it's typically you're either hearing it happen at home, the people are being that way and you're being that way too, or they're in systems that they realize it needs to happen. I remember this great, and I am going a tiny bit off topic, but I remember this great quote by Angela Davis, and she was talking about racism, right? And she said, I think it may be harder to stop sexism than racism because racism ends in my home. When I go home, everybody is Black. Everyone's Black. So we're not being racist to each other at home. We're not even being, implicitly racist, right? Let alone explicitly racist. So that's not happening at home. But there is still a gender hierarchy at home, right? And so that was interesting to me because it made me realize it's like systems sink in there. And so we're doing a system that's saying hierarchies are okay. We are. If you're participating in that standard model of inclusion and you're saying hierarchies are okay, you are telling your kids hierarchies are okay in all forms of life. Then racial hierarchies are fine. Class hierarchies are fine. Gender, sexuality, religion, all of those things, right? And obviously that's a huge problem. Somebody said they're living in it and don't know. And Dr. Coleman sounds great. I'm ready. All right. So what schools can be? So connected, collaborative by teachers offering up different opportunities for classroom swapping, sharing, observing. I talked to you about how I've done that. I'm hoping that going forward, even if you're a gen ed teacher in this, I don't know if most of the folks in here are special ed teachers. And of course, I know some people here are not teaching in the classroom at all, but figure out ways to either you do it yourself. So if you're a gen ed teacher and you're one of those gen ed teachers, really cool, and you love having the special ed kids in your class, maybe you ask, because maybe that special ed teacher doesn't think to do it. Maybe you say, oh, and can we also sit in one day in your classroom and y'all lead some stuff for us, right? You could do that. And again, you'll have this one tool that I think will be helpful for you to do it, right? And schools could also be places that don't feel like a caste system. Like we kind of live in a world that feels that way overall, right? And I'm sure because everybody was on their social justice grind this last year that a lot of people read the book Caste. And they're like, oh man, there's strong caste systems in places like India, but also America, blah, blah, blah. But we don't need our schools to be that way. Oops, sorry about that. We can figure out ways to shut that down in every way, shape, or form in a school. And schools are great places. I do think almost all the people who are running schools or working in schools around the country really love kids, really want to see them thrive and become, these amazing adults. Well, one thing you can do for them is you can shut down school class systems, right? Even when they seem so small. All right, so action steps to do this. So I kind of told y'all a quick thing like, okay, a teacher invites you into their classroom, you can invite them back. Or if you're a special ed teacher, when someone invites you to your classroom, invite them back. But also, as a special ed teacher, you can think about, okay, I just need to reach out to teachers and see which ones will have me, right? And I think I'm fortunate. I'm a person, I've worked at my school for a long time. Heck, I won some big awards and all that crap. So a lot of people knew my name. So it is very easy for teachers to think about me, right? They think about, oh, what about Kareem class? Let's check it out, right? And then boom, it's happening and they don't even know it. I'm just making it work, right? But for that is not how it's going to happen in all schools. So y'all have to be intentional about it. So I want y'all to go back to your classroom. And if you can, take a picture of this, or like I said, email me as well. Take a picture and think about where can your community grow in oneness. So let's say you teach at a school like the school I taught at when I started, and even my second school. And I think maybe somebody's here from my second school Like I said, I haven't seen all the list of names yet, but I know one of the teachers in my seconds who talked about this, and that school is the Children's Center for Neurodevelopmental Studies in Glendale, Arizona. Oh, yep, she's here. I see you. Hi, Linda. So maybe you teach at a school where you don't have to worry about this issue. You don't have to worry about straight up. Yes, I saw you, man. You don't have to worry about that straight up gen ed folks, special ed kids are kind of treated as third class citizens after the gen ed people and the gifted people, right? So maybe you work at a school like that school. In that school, right, I think about when I taught there, my classroom ran like this machine. It was, and Amanda will back me up here. I'm not lying to y'all, folks. It was really, I was in there for a long time, right? I cared. I figured out the best way, and me, my students, and every once in a while, I worked alone sometimes with a bunch of self-contained folks, or I had like one assistant in my classroom, one paraprofessional, and we did a really good job. So we had this really great high school community there, and when I include that, I want to include people like Amanda, who was a music therapist there, right? Which, by the way, music therapy, we need it in all schools. I wish I had it in my district. Music therapists were there. The speech therapist was there. Occupational therapy. We had a big occupational therapy school, right? So we had this great community in my classroom. And I remember there was a year or two when I was there that I would go to other classrooms and kind of try and help them form communities in their classroom. But one thing I know that I never did there is I never said, I got to figure out a way to connect all these classrooms, because we only had like 6 classrooms in there. We had a middle school, 2 high schools, and about 3 elementary schools, or something like 3 elementary classes. And that I didn't necessarily do. Heck, I didn't necessarily do it with the employees at the time, because I was young and I was a little feisty. We won't get into that. But think about, and so I should have thought about, where can my community grow in oneness there? She laughed because she knows it's true. I'm not, there's no lies in anything I said right now. So think about how your community can grow, where your community can grow in oneness. And if your school is doing this already, then think about other ways to do it, right? And then, of course, think about which manageable steps you can take. So for me, it was, where could my community grow in oneness? We had it in my classroom. And I'm going back to Maribel. What manageable steps I took? So simple. It just came to me like, hey, every time somebody invites me in, I invite them in. That was it. So simple, but I was like, that's going to make a huge difference on our campus in the way people view my students, and which is going to do a huge thing for helping the Maribel community grow in oneness, right? There's a ton of kids on the Maribel campus now who don't look down on my kids. And there's a few kids who even have real friendships with my students. And that's huge. For self-contained, if you teach self-contained, you know that's huge. And then who can be on your side? How will you know? And at my school, I am fortunate enough where almost everyone is on my side. From principal, strong shout out to John Darty, to assistant principals in my school, people like Katie Loker and those folks, to counselors, other teachers who I've worked with in there. So many paraprofessionals, right? Even the we call them classified workers in our school, who are non-certified workers in our school. Even those folks are helping build that community. It's a wonderful thing. I hope your schools can get there. And then how will I know who are the allies? And I think y'all know. Y'all will know who the allies are. And lastly, who or what might be a stumbling block, and how will you know? And so for me, I thought to myself, the stumbling block might be me here. Because like I said, the Maribel community and my class and me, really solid. There was a couple who's, I won't talk about that out loud. There's a couple people I knew that might be stumbling blocks, but I knew that the bigger one might be me, right? Because I am often heavy schedule, particularly after school. I'm doing these kinds of things. And so I am often that stumbling block. And how will you know? You got to think about that, right? You got to think about it and look inward and say, am I the person who's too tired to do this, to do one extra new thing? Am I the person who is unwilling? Am I the person who says gen ed's kids are for suckers? Because that's how I was when I first came to Maryville. I was like, oof, I want to stay away from those folks because I was scared of them. We got to think about those folks as well when you're building this plan. All right. And I realized I got to move on. So this is the reflection tool that I talked about. These are some of the things that I think are super helpful when gen ed folks come into special ed classrooms. Like, how is this class different and how is it the same? because you want everybody to realize, like, sure, there's differences. The reason why I put that question first is because I know that is foremost on their mind, because we live in a world in which we're saying, hey, think about everybody's differences, right? Which is sad, but it is true. But then how is this class the same as ours? Because I want them to now reflect on the fact that, oh, these students are the same. And I want teachers to even think about, hey, are these students your age? Do they live in your same neighborhood? Right? Because if that's the case, then how come y'all aren't friends? How come you don't hang with even one student in any of the 3 self-contained classrooms in America? I want those kinds of questions coming up, right? What are some of the things that surprise you? Because again, a lot of times they're going to come in with bias because of the world, not because they're not nice people, because we told them that students in self-contained programs aren't the best. So they're going to come in and be like, oh, I was really surprised by the fact that they're learning the exact same subject as me. So when they come into my class, when I teach world history, I wrote the world history curriculum for, it's called Community Skills in our district, but self-contained. I wrote the world history curriculum in our district. So I wrote it following the exact timeline as the gen ed folks for their world history. So when they came into my classroom, they're like, hey, we are also learning about this just in a different way, right? The different tools that my students are using to learn it. Those are some of the things that might surprise them and might connect them, right? And all of that stuff, and I can't go over all of them because I realize we only have 8 minutes right now. So 45-minute sessions are quick, super, super quick. But these are some of the kinds of questions that could build into the thinking that hopefully will allow these gen ed students to say, you know what, we got this all wrong. We got this all wrong. And I would love if you are at a school like mine, for you to kind of come in there and say, you know, maybe on your student observation reflection tool, if you do something like this, to say, hey, how are you different from the kids in the gifted program, right? To really get them to thinking about this kind of hierarchy, right? It's like, do you not view them as your friends? Do you think that they're, you know, that they're so bright that you need to look up to them? Because that's another thing that's happening in these self-contained classrooms, and anybody who works in that classroom can back me up on this. My students were looking up to their gen ed peers all of the time. All of the time. They were looking up to them. And as nice as that is, they are peers, and that should not be their relationship, right? Because I don't know a gen ed student who looked up to any of my students. So it shouldn't be their relationship, right? And so, you know, with this kind of tool, maybe have them reflect, do you look up to the kids in gifted program? Not just about their academics, do you look up to them in their lives? Their answer is probably going to be no. And so if that's the case, don't look down on mine, right? Don't look down on the kids in self-contained programs, right? Give them a chance to just be your peer, your friend. All right, I do got to move on though. So where to go immediately, if not sooner? I'm going to talk about these programs real quick, but they are in the slides, and I saw that Michelle put them in the slides for y'all. So they're there, and there's links to get to their pages. So Unified Special Olympics is a little different than the Special Olympics I talked about in the top. Unified Special Olympics is Special Olympics where you have to have the same amount of gen ed folks and the same amount of special education folks working together as a sport. So my class is one of the classes signed up for Unified Special Olympics. And so, for instance, it's been a couple of years because of COVID, of course, right? But in 2019, like, we did a basketball tournament together. And the teams truly were 2 or 3 kids from my class playing with 2 or 3 kids from gen ed classes. And they were just truly on the same team, just playing basketball against another school together, right? And that is a different kind of vibe than just we're helping these kids play basketball, which I think you probably will see in typical type programs. So Unified Special Olympics is great. I have a link in the resources where you can just click on there, navigate their site, and figure out a way to get involved in Unified Special Olympics near you. Best Buddies, national program. So, and I also linked you to, I believe, the International Best Buddies site. And I think the page in which you can go to request, it actually takes a long time. There's like a backlog, and it's difficult to have the program, but it takes about a year sometimes. But you can request the Best Buddies program, and they kind of send you a kit on what to do. And that is just, Best Buddies is essentially a kit where gen ed, special ed folks, as much as possible on the school campus, are hanging out together. And it is hanging out together. It's definitely different than just, again, them teaching them in their classrooms or they're helping my students out or something like that. It's like they're off together at lunchtime, just walking around the quad. Like if you've ever been to my campus, that's what everybody does at lunchtime. Really cool stuff. People PE, and this is a model of PE classes because it's called People PE on our campus, and I did not spell it wrong, by the way. It is PEOPEL. It's like it's an acronym, and so it just models of PE classes where gen ed and special ed students work together. So that is essentially that, and I think that happens on many campuses. But if it doesn't, there's curriculums out there that I can even help y'all with that. If y'all want to start that kind of a program, it's super fun, and it again bridges those gaps. Like our kids, as a matter of fact, do a talent show at the end of the year together. So the gen ed folks and the special ed folks are doing dance routines together and singing songs together. And it's really, really cool. And in their PE class, of course, they're playing sports together and all that. And it's really cool. I don't know if it would always be called People PE, but it would be some model where they work together. And lastly, the IDEA work at the IDEA website. Individual Disabilities Educational Act. That, of course, is all of the reasons why we have self-contained programs in schools and things like that. But they have many programs and initiatives that you can check out as well, and that is linked to. All of those are linked, so you're good. Well, People PE is not linked. Lastly, what should we be looking for? I know I only got 3 minutes. True friendships. So how are a student with learning differences interacting? They are not looking up to them. They're actually their friends. They're maybe hanging out on the weekends sometimes, maybe playing a video game together. I often now get to say, hey, Sean, did you actually hang out with Jose? Yes, we played World of Warcraft together, whatever they're playing nowadays. I doubt it's World of Warcraft, but that's what came to my head. But the online games where you can chat and all that stuff. Teacher collaboration. Is it one-sided? Is it just gen ed folks asking you to come? Or no, is it happening both ways? And upticks of opportunities for special education classes to host events and activities. Again, we're always, always, always just attending. But it would be nice if we are doing, right? We're the ones building. We're the ones saying, hey, we're putting on an assembly or there's this, cool thing that we're doing, come do it. And lastly, I want to close with a quote. I got through it, look at me. This is Cesar Chavez, who looms huge in my school community. I blew that. Looms huge in my school community because, again, we are a strong and proud Latinx community. We cannot seek achievement for ourselves and forget about progress and prosperity of our community. Our ambitions must be broad enough to include the aspiration and needs of others for their sakes and for our own. And for our own in the end is very important because, like I said, my life was changed by hanging out with some folks with special needs. We do not want to rob the gen ed students in our schools for a chance for them to have their lives changed by some special ed students on their school campuses. All right, I think I'm good to go. Y'all can leave. Look at that. I got you out there right on time. If there's questions, though, I am here. I don't know if I can stay. I don't know if this thing's going to just close down on me. But if you have questions, you have my email, or you can ask me right now, and I'll try to answer.
Kareem, it looks like you got one in the chat from Amanda.
Okay. Are those program suggestions only within schools, or can a public you can randomly join some of those? Amanda, People PE, of course, is school related. But I believe that, and I think Best Buddies is school related, but Unified Special Ed is totally not. You can jump right in, and you just say your son has a few friends. Your son could jump right in, and they would figure that out for him. And of course, all of the stuff on IDEA is for everyone, not just schools. So it's a mix. Two of them are school related. People PE is school related, and Best Buddies is school related. At least I don't know of a Best Buddies that has happened outside of campus. All right, and lots of thank y'all for attending, by the way. All the people saying thank you for attending. Oh, I'll stop the share.